Senator, it's great to have you on CNBC. Thank you so much for joining us here at the Munich Security Conference. Okay, so we're here. One of the main topics, of course, is what's happening between the U.S. and China, because we know that the foreign minister of China is here. Antony Blinken is here as well. Do you anticipate they're going to actually have a meeting?
I'm hopeful they will, because I think we need to have open lines of communication and dialogue, even at a moment of great tension where China's intentional sending of a spy balloon over the mainland United States has elevated the amount of concern and even anger among members of Congress. We have one of the largest bipartisan congressional delegations here in history. We're here, of course, to talk about Ukraine and pulling together, sustaining the NATO alliance, the work of our partners and allies around the world against Russia's aggressive invasion of Ukraine, but also to talk about China's surveillance and the ways in which China's economic activity, its surveillance activity, has real consequences for the world.
Now, unlike previous years, we don't have any representation here from Russia or from Iran. Are we in danger of being just an echo chamber of Western thought?
I think what we are going to be is an opportunity for the whole family of NATO, of the Western alliances, to work together to make sure that we can sustain what is going to be a very challenging year for supporting Ukraine's success on the battlefield, sustaining their civilian population, sustaining the millions of Ukrainian refugees that are spread throughout Europe. If that's an echo chamber, I actually think it's a focus on what is the most important conflict of this decade.
But there is a serious disconnect, is there not, with essentially what is the global South, whether it be when it comes to OPEC plus policy or the thoughts of those who are sitting in India and saying this just isn't our fight.
There are representatives from the global South here who I think are important to be heard. The delegation that I'm traveling with will leave from here and go to 5 countries in Africa, from the Sahel to Southern Africa, for exactly that reason. Yeah. We need to better engage with those who have refused to engage one way or the other, whether in the UN or on the world stage or in providing support or in engaging with sanctions, and who say, frankly, we're still recovering from the pandemic. We're seeing an impact on our costs for food and fertilizer from Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and we'd rather stay out of it. We need to engage, and we need to show that they've got options, that they've got partners, and that they've got a better pathway forward.
Tell me this. When you think about what's happening with U.S. relations across the African continent at this point, when I was speaking with Amos Hochstein, the U.S. Special Representative on Energy, just a few weeks ago, he was saying we are certainly, as the United States, behind when it comes to the fight for mineral resources. All of those things, of course, going to be totally essential to technology, AI, and simply blockchain. What is the United States prepared to do to get back in the game?
The United States has already proposed a partnership for critical minerals with a number of Southern African countries, has made a massive investment through the Inflation Reduction Act, signed into law by President Biden late last year, in attracting investment in mining and processing. We now need to connect those two in consultation with our European partners and allies who we're meeting with here in Munich, but also in partnership with countries in Southern Africa. I'll name specifically Zambia, Mozambique, DRC, South Africa, that have dramatic amounts of mineral resources, but also a significant need for investment in human development, in security and stability, and in democracy.
What about your European allies? Because there is a great deal of discomfort, as you know, with the Inflation Reduction Act, and particularly when it comes to the green energy space, particularly these new statements coming out of the White House, particularly with environmentally friendly policies when it comes to EVs.
Right. 6 months ago, a year ago, at this exact conference, European friends were criticizing the United States for lacking enough climate ambition. Now we're on the other side of that. They're saying you're being too ambitious. You're providing too much in the way of industrial investments and support. I think we can and should align between Europe's climate ambition expressed in their border carbon adjustment mechanism and the United States' now new climate ambition expressed in our subsidies through the IRA.
Can you do that without a carbon tax or without, for example, a windfall tax on the profits of energy companies?
I believe we can impute a price on carbon through our regulatory burden on the production of high carbon intensity products, whether it's oil and gas or steel or aluminum or fertilizer. And I think we can harmonize that price on carbon with what's being done in Canada, in the UK, and the EU. If we don't do that, we'll face the very unfortunate aspect where we might end up with European tariffs on American products and American subsidies outcompeting European products. at this moment when it's critical that we pull together, particularly to support Ukraine, particularly as the free world, to show that we have a common agenda in climate and in digital freedom and individual privacy, to be distracted by a tariff fight would strike me as a missed opportunity.
Tell me this. With regards to Ukraine, one of my previous guests was saying they still could lose this war with Vladimir Putin. It's a very real possibility. In your mind, is the West doing enough?
I think we can and should do more. I think President Biden's best chapter of his 2 years of leadership as president has been the way that he tactically released intelligence just in advance of the beginning of the war, just over a year ago when we were here at the Munich Security Conference.
Which a lot of people at that time still didn't believe.
There were many Europeans. In fact, President Zelensky addressed the conference. It was clear he was skeptical of American intelligence. That we have built a strong and enduring global partnership to impose sanctions on Russia, to provide military support for Ukraine, I think has been a real accomplishment of consultation and collaboration. At times it has taken longer than I would have hoped for us to deliver the weapons needed because we've done so much consultation.
Can they win?
They can win. Absolutely, Ukraine can win.
And what happens if Russia loses? What does that world look like in your mind?
If Putin's Russia loses on the battlefield in Ukraine, I think that's a win for democracy, for the West, for the rules-based order. And I think that moves us back to a trajectory where we could restore some of the order that the world knew in recent decades. I think if Putin wins, if he succeeds in grinding Ukraine down, as he has in Syria, as he did in Chechnya, the consequences for the world are, frankly, stark, because that encourages other autocrats around the world to use force to rewrite the boundaries of the world.
Last week I spoke with the IMF's managing director, Kristalina Georgieva, and she told me that Ukraine is going to need between $80 and $84 billion this year alone just to keep the wheels of government and their war machine moving. It's a huge number. Already we're seeing donor fatigue. Do you believe that the nations of the world are going to come together and get that money to Ukraine?
I'm confident they will. We in the United States Congress appropriated another $45 billion just in December to ensure that the Biden administration has a pipeline of funds, both for resupplying our own military stocks, for supporting the budget of the Ukrainian government, and for providing cutting-edge military weapons, hardware, and sustainment for Ukraine's counteroffensive this spring.
Can they do that without aircraft? Can they win without it?
I'm sorry?
Can they do this without the aircraft? Can they win without it?
At some point, we are going to need to provide security guarantees for Ukraine once we've reached some point where on the battlefield there is a ceasefire in negotiations. At that point, we're going to need to provide Ukraine with the most cutting-edge conventional weaponry possible to deter Russia from renewing its attacks on Ukraine. And by that point, we need to be in a position to provide them with modern advanced fighter jets. I think we should begin the training and the preparations for that now. That may be a year or even 2 years away. But I do think we should prepare for providing Ukraine with all the weaponry they need that is conventional, that can secure their future against an incessant and aggressive Putin.
Final question. Ukraine itself, prior to the invasion, one of the most corrupt countries in the world. There have already been instances where President Zelensky's government has cracked down on corruption. That's a lot of money to go to a country where we aren't necessarily sure it's going to get to the pockets of those who need it. How is the United States and Europe prepared to ensure that that money is spent and spent the right way? In
each of the supplemental appropriation bills that I had a hand in writing over the last year, we've given funding to the inspectors general, and we've got a robust tracking and accountability and transparency program, both for the military items that are being given to the Ukrainian armed forces and for funding that goes to the Ukrainian government. Look, we have to recognize that in the long wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, there were widespread and significant instances of the misdirection of military hardware and of corruption. We should not expect that Ukraine will be free of any such problems, but we should expect that President Zelensky will act promptly on credible information about corruption, which he has done.
Isn't there an argument to be made that we should, instead of being giving the money government to government, be giving that money to the private sector, which can actually show that kind of accountability? They have balance sheets, they have books. They could literally show that money getting to where it needs to go. And I'm talking about the private power producers in the country.
I'm not sure I exactly follow the line of your questioning. Ukraine is a country where their civilian power infrastructure is literally being pummeled by
so is the private power.
Russian missile attacks
Senator,
every day.
So is the private power infrastructure, and to my mind and to my understanding, the government-to-government funds are not reaching the private power producers who produce as much as 40 to 60% of Ukraine's power. So my question is, wouldn't it make sense to give that aid directly to those private sector companies?
Certainly something I'm happy to look at. My impression is that under USAID, we've been giving significant amounts of funding and through some of our partners and allies, material assistance to the power producers of Ukraine. The distinction between what parts of that are state or parastatal and what parts are private, I don't have enough detail on that to be able to give you a meaningful answer.